Wouldst thou like to live deliciously?
What's up, cinephiles? My name is TJ, and welcome to Cinemateq. And it is time for our weekly, or really bi-weekly, A24 Cult podcast. This is episode number 2, which means we must be talking about Ginger and Rosa, the second or third film released by A24, as they released both this film and Spring Breakers on the exact same day. We discussed that in the last podcast and decided that it was not the best move to release a film against yourself, but here we are. We've made the decision today.
They were that confident in both films.
Well, I imagine that Ginger and Rosa opened, like that opening date was probably for the UK, and then it would have opened later in Canada and, well, other parts of North America.
And I can't imagine that you'd be cutting into your markets too badly. Like the people who are going to go see Ginger and Rosa are probably going to be a very different demographic from the ones who
You
are
don't
going
think
to
that Ginger and Rosa
Spring
and Spring Breakers have overlapping?
I mean, they're both about young
audiences?
girls.
Yes.
Finding themselves, coming
Yes.
of age,
Yes.
engaging in sexual behavior, and just trying to find their place in the world.
James Franco is a drug and gun dealer in both films, which really threw me for a loop.
I was not expecting that.
No, that came right out of left field.
1960s London. James Franco does an incredible Cockney accent.
Yep.
Yeah, but his dreads worked. Like I didn't think they would, but they played.
Anyways, James Franco's definitely not in this film. That was all a joke. And now we're going to talk about serious things. And to do that, I have Sandra and Tim with me once again.
Hello.
How are you guys? How you guys doing? How you feeling?
Good.
Very
Good.
well. Excited to be here.
You should be, because this is an important film for us to talk about.
Yes.
Everyone knows the film Ginger and Rosa, so we can just skip past the plot synopses, I feel like. Just kidding, we're going to get into that because I don't think anyone's seen this film. But first, just to tell you a bit about what this channel is and a bit about what this show is, on Cinemateq, we always want to have great conversations about film, and in order to do that, we think these podcasts are a great way to go through film history to a certain degree and have conversations that hopefully don't include too much evaluative language. Although if you listen to our Double Dragon podcast that came out last week, there was quite a bit. And at some point, you just got to say, maybe we just talk about the things we like in the movie, because it was that kind of movie. I think Ginger and Rosa will probably lead to more better conversations in regards to what I would hope for this channel. And this show in particular, A24 Cult, we're basically just going through the entire catalog of A24 because we all love A24, but we haven't seen every A24 film. And I think part of what we're trying to do with this is get a better idea as to what, if anything we can say about A24 as a brand and what that brand means for the films that they go after. Is it just the films that they like, or is there something kind of linking each one together, either aesthetically or thematically or something along those lines? It's probably not it, considering all the films from A24 I've seen, but there might be something there. There might be something that we might be able to touch on after we've seen, almost all 80 or 90 of the films that they've put out. But we need to stop talking about the future. It's time to talk about 1960s London and also 1942 London and other parts of time. Actually, those are the only two that take place in Ginger and Rosa. And I guess we'll start with a little bit of a plot synopsis. Actually, no. You know what we did in the last one that I really liked? Even though we don't do evaluative language on this show, on this channel, or at least we try not to, let's just give general impressions. Like it, hate it. What stood out to you about this film? Keep it brief, keep it short. But tell me what you thought about this movie.
I actually didn't mind it. It was not my favorite, but it was good. Like, it wasn't bad. Like, I really love the cinematography. It was beautifully shot. But there were aspects of the characters that I kind of was eh. Like, I feel like they could have been a little more detailed in the way that they brought those characters out. I wanted to know more about their backstories, who they are, kind of thing. And that didn't really fully come through on screen. But otherwise, I mean, it was good. I enjoyed it.
Tim, initial thoughts?
Yeah, I'm in agreement with a lot of that. It's not generally the film that I would be attracted to in the first place. It seemed a bit attracted isn't the right word. It seemed like it was a sort of an introspective think piece. The trailer that I watched before I watched it, it's like, oh, okay, this is going to be a sort of a coming of age drama from another time, period piece about two young girls. And it's not usually the kind of thing that bubbles to the top of my list in terms of films, just by nature of how many things are out there and the things that I generally gravitate towards. But I totally agree. The cinematography was incredible. There are so many like shot compositions that I was just like, oh, that is a really beautiful shot. Like that's amazingly. But on the whole, it was easy to tune out. Or a little bit too easy to tune out, just by the structure of it. It seemed to be, especially in the early going, more of a series of sort of moments rather than like a narrative thread. It was just sort of like here's a slice of their life, here's another slice of their life, here's a moment in time, this sort of thing. And by definition, it was kind of disjointed that way, and so you weren't really going. There wasn't a this happens, so this happens, so this happens. There wasn't a narrative propulsion. It was more just sort of picking moments along their journey that tried to give you a little bit of sort of character insight. But by the end of it, I still didn't really feel like I knew either character particularly well. Of the titular characters, they seemed a little archetypey, I guess. Yeah, I wasn't entirely sure what the film was trying to say, other than talk about this one particular relationship, which I don't think they went deeply enough into. And so I don't know if I'd recommend it to anybody else. But it was like I said, there are good points in terms of the cinematography, and the performances are pretty good. On the whole, some of the accents are a little dodgy because they have a shocking amount of American actors trying to do British accents, and I keep wanting to say it left me a little cold. The one word that I would use to sum the movie up would be sweaters, because it seemed to be just everyone was wearing a sweater.
Well, it is London.
Exactly.
It's chilly,
and it was always autumn, no matter what time period that they jumped to. So yeah,
very true. So for me, I overall liked the film. I know that for my own personal tastes, I am drawn to and tend to like films that have this kind of cinematographic style to it. So I know you guys both talked about the cinematography being really good. That's kind of right up my alley as far as what I like to watch. I'm typically not as concerned with characters as I think other people are these days. Like I know in discussions with other people always talk about, character arcs, and a movie can only be good if it has a satisfying character arc. And I don't necessarily agree with that. I've enjoyed many of films that have no characters in it at all. So this idea that character arcs are essential and integral to enjoying a film, I don't necessarily agree with. Beyond that, there were things in the film that I could identify with a little bit. Mostly the fact that the main character's name was Ginger, and as I am one, I felt I could empathize with her that much better.
And your real name is Africa as well, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh, Tim, you ruined you ruined it. You ruined the movie. Spoiler warning, man. Jeez. That was actually, that was one thing. Maybe I'll talk about it right now because it's just very quick. Going into the film and seeing that the main character's name was Ginger and that her hair was ginger, I'm like, come on, is this going to be a thing where the mother is so like non-inventive, like has no creativity in her body? It's just like, oh, I have a red-haired child, I'm going to name her Ginger. That's so easy.
I have to do it.
But then when the film starts, you see that the mother of Ginger is Christina Hendricks, who is also a redhead. And I was just kind of like, bullshit. If that woman grew up a ginger in England and then named her child Ginger, she is the worst person in the world, because gingers, especially in that country, get shit on every day. And then like halfway through the film, we find out that her name is actually Africa, and people just call her Ginger as a nickname.
Maybe that was Christina Hendricks' character, whose name is Natalie, I believe. Maybe that was her character arc. She was just a horrible, horrible person who wanted her daughter to suffer as she had. I mean, it's not in the movie, but we could make that extrapolation.
Maybe there could be some subtext there.
Definitely.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of subtext, let's talk about the film like we usually do, where we take away all this evaluative nonsense. Yeah. Just kidding, it'll creep its way back in. But first, we need to start with a little bit of a plot synopsis. So to give the listeners a little bit of a glimpse into what we're talking about, I'm going to use the very short one that I'm sure we are going to fill in the gaps on from IMDb. But essentially, Ginger and Rosa is a look at the lives of two teenage girls, inseparable friends named Ginger and Rosa, if you couldn't guess that for yourselves. And they are growing up in 1960s London as the Cuban Missile Crisis looms, and the pivotal event that comes to redefine their relationship. That relationship, for people who haven't seen it, is Rosa having sex with Ginger's dad.
Whose name is Roland.
Yes, his name is Roland.
And he has insisted that she not call him Dad for some reason. But so she calls him Roland, and that confused me for a while because I wasn't sure why she was calling him Roland.
Oh, I missed that actually.
Yeah.
Oh dear.
No, because he's played by Alessandro Nivola, I believe. I'm pronouncing his first name correctly, and he's fantastic. He's one of these guys that I notice every time he's in a movie, and I was like, oh, why isn't he bigger? Why isn't he in larger movies? He's incredibly watchable. He's a great leading man. He's a fantastic villain. There's just he has a very good presence on screen, and he portrays Roland, who is a professor of some kind.
Yes, and I think
He's talking about his students a lot.
Yeah, one of the things that they mentioned, and maybe we can just use this as a way to start fleshing out the film and what actually happened in it. Roland is a professor, and he was somewhat of a leader in the anti-war movement back in
the 40s. Yeah, he was
like
a pacifist who refused to fight for World War II,
Yeah.
and so he went to jail for it, which was a very traumatic experience for him.
Yeah, and then they sort of hinted this in the film that some of his writing and some of the writing that he's currently doing as professor is being used as the basis for the beginning of the anti-war, anti-nuclear bomb movement that was taking place in the early 1960s. Roland in this, I think, figures prominently into the film. He believes in the individual, particularly the role of the individual in determining how they live their life. As a consequence of this, he is not really able to see how his actions affect other people or how they could potentially affect other people, which leads to a lot of bad stuff happening. One could say that his own selfishness, to a certain degree, is the reason why things happen in the film at all. Mm-hmm. So actually, Roland is the protagonist. This film should be called Roland and nobody else.
They retroactively read it for the DVD release. It's just we realized we messed up. We had the whole thing backwards. It's not about those two young girls trying to find themselves.
It's Roland and everybody.
It's about their dad.
Roland and nobody else.
Just scratch out Ginger and Rosa and just leave the RO and add a
There you go.
L-A-N-D
It's so easy.
There
It's
you
an
go.
easy fix,
It's all
guys.
fixed.
Anyone who
Won't cost
has this film already in their home collection, you can just do that.
Yeah.
Or you can send it to us and we'll do it for you and we'll mail it back to you as long as you pay shipping and handling.
Yeah.
So to get a bit more into the plot, the film starts with Christina Hendricks and the mother of Rosa. They are both giving birth in a hospital. This is in 1943, I believe. And they didn't know each other up till this point. They just saw each other giving birth next to each other, held hands. And
They might be best friends. We don't get a lot of context. It's just
I read something this is outside of the world of the film that said that they didn't know each other.
Oh, okay.
But you're right in
In terms of the text of the film, DJ.
Yeah, no, the film
They
is
reach out, they hold hands, and then we cut to the kids holding hands.
You're right, Tim.
Yeah.
You're right. So I'll just say that. I'll say that all
Only
the
the
time.
text, DJ.
Tim, you're right. God. So yes, Ginger and Rosa are best friends. They come of age. They're 17 years old in 1960s London. They're starting to experiment with stuff. They're maybe not the best people, cutting class, smoking, doing all that teenage angst kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And then their paths start to diverge from each other while they're still so intertwined with one another. So they start to become very different people while still inhabiting each other's lives. Ginger gets into the anti-war movement, the anti-nuclear bomb movement specifically. Rosa reveals that she is a Catholic and then does everything counter to what Catholicism teaches in a lot of ways. And it kind of progresses out from there. Rosa is very interested in boys, whereas Ginger is seen as maybe having affections here and there, but never really pursuing much of anything unless Rosa's around.
Yeah, there's a lot of meaningful looks between Ginger and the activist organizer.
Yes,
But
yes.
they don't seem to consummate or even
No.
they have a drink that Ginger vomits afterwards. But we get no indication that they had any kind of romantic relationship or anything like that. Whereas Rosa, often in Ginger's presence, will go off and have a tryst of some kind. And
Yes. So as we progress through the film, Christina Hendricks and her character's relationship with Ginger starts to fracture as well. Roland, who is Ginger's father, turns out to be kind of a dick and is probably having extramarital affairs with other women, specifically younger students. Then he leaves Christina Hendricks and goes off into what is maybe a hippie commune of professors and stuff, like an intellectual's house only, let's say. And then the relationship between Christina Hendricks and Ginger starts to disintegrate as well, leading up to the scene, Tim, that you just mentioned, where Ginger is vomiting in her bed. So then Ginger goes off, lives with her dad for a bit, but then Rosa and Roland hook up on a boat that Ginger is also on, which is awkward. And that leads to Ginger and Rosa's relationship starting to fracture more. And then we get the eventual reveal that Rosa is maybe, possibly, but definitely pregnant with Roland's son, or Roland's child. And then everything just starts to spiral out from there. Ginger has a bit of a breakdown, confides in her godparents, who 2 out of 3 of them are American for some reason, played by Annette Bening and Oliver Platt. Because of course. And then there is a final confrontation where all of the players in this tale are together in an apartment. Everything is revealed. Christina Hendricks tries to kill herself. And then the movie ends with Roland and Ginger waiting to find out what happened to Christina Hendricks. And I can't remember her character name, so I'm just going to keep calling her Natalie. It's probably, at this point, it's probably just better if I keep calling her Christina Hendricks. We've established this. You guys can call her Natalie, but that'll just confuse everybody. And so the film ends with Roland and Ginger waiting to find out what happened to Christina Hendricks / Natalie, and with Ginger writing a poem that in some way absolves Rosa for everything that's happened and just says, I forgive you, even though there's nothing really to be forgiven, which I somewhat disagree with. I think there's a lot that could be forgiven considering Rosa's behavior. And that's pretty much the film. Did I leave out any poignant details?
I mean, they smoke a lot of cigarettes.
They do smoke a lot of cigarettes.
But it's the 60s, so you can be forgiven for that. There is, just I would add that Ginger, or Annette Bening and Oliver Platt are Americans who, Oliver Platt is the partner of Timothy Spall's character, who is, I believe he mentions that he is Ginger's godfather. So it's very quick. They try to get the exposition through in sort of naturalistic dialogue, but it's hard to sort of track a little bit. Where Annette Bening is, I believe, a activist from America who encourages Ginger's activist leanings, and then meets up with her at one of the anti-nuclear demonstrations, and then helps to bail her out when she gets arrested. Those are the other main characters, I suppose, in the entire film. Other than that, it feels like you nailed it. Yeah.
So then, thinking about the film as a whole, and I can see that you guys both wrote copious amounts of notes for this particular podcast recording.
Yes.
What was, and Sandra, we'll start with you. What was the thing that stood out to you the most about the film that you thought was kind of interesting that we could start discussing?
So the thing that I found myself looking at a lot, I know obviously like character is kind of like not a big thing for some people.
Like
hinting at you, TJ.
I mean,
but for me, like I like to look at the characters very in depth, just to understand how they were created and what they're kind of trying to convey in the story. And for me, I was looking at them, and like for some reason, it was very fun for me to just go in there. I'm very interested in psychology too, so it was just very fun to just kind of like diagnose them as I'm going through.
So how did what did they come out as?
Narcissist.
Actually, for Nat, who was Christina Hendricks, she felt a bit narcissistic towards Ginger. Very much like she thought about herself and herself only in certain moments. But it sort of came out as more of a codependency later on in the film when she was kind of presenting Roland with the meat pie, and he wasn't validating her, and she was kind of like feeling shitty about it. That sort of came out as like clearly she has like some insecurities and she does care. There is, a crack in the armor there. But for Roland, it was very much kind of textbook narcissist, sort of. Yeah. So it was just very much like I'm into my own ideas and my own ideas only.
I think I actually have somewhere in my notes here that Roland is a quote huge dick.
Yeah.
And he's blameless, and like there's never anything that could possibly be his fault. He's like constant. He's intelligent enough to philosophize his way out of any particular consequence of his actions, and he
Yeah.
articulates how it is society that imposes these limitations upon us, rather than me banging someone outside my relationship is a bad thing. It's like, don't think about that. Think about how society is limiting us.
Yeah. He never fully wants to take responsibility for anything at all.
Yeah, and he's almost developed like the intellectual language in order to just get out of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As long as I sound smart enough, nobody's going to blame me. But yeah, and then Ginger in the middle of all that is getting both sides of the coin of like seeking validation from Rosa, but also such a firm belief in this war thing because she really wants that validation from her father as well. So it's kind of like she's adapted more towards Christina Hendricks's, issues and stuff like that. And because of that, we see her sort of have that mental breakdown at the end. And that was sort of like the pinnacle of her character. I really like Ginger's character the most. Obviously, she was the main character, but I thought she was the most well-rounded of all of them. She made the most sense. And also the Godfathers, I just love them just because they were great. They were clearly the very much like sound advice, the people who were kind of like helping her on her side kind of thing.
They seemed to genuinely care for her too, whereas it felt like you weren't so sure from her real parents.
Exactly. Which is like, if you think about it, like you would think that potentially Ginger wouldn't be so affected by her parents because she has that support system. But, she also is living under primary care under both these people. So it's not like she's constantly getting that.
They're like shelter
positive.
from the storm, but she still lives with the storm.
Exactly.
So kind of going back to what you mentioned about Ginger as far as her psychology in terms of what her role or what she wanted to get out of the anti-war movement, do you think that her intentions with it were inauthentic? That she didn't actually genuinely care about it and she was just using it as a kind of coping mechanism?
I think yes and no. I think she genuinely wanted to believe in it and she just didn't realize that this was also her kind of feeding into her father's narrative and sort of trying to get his validation as well. Because the way that she reacted, especially when Rosa, anyone would react poorly to that, but it also felt like she was trying to get his affection and she now felt like she's being pushed out of the picture. So that's how I kind of took it.
With Christina Hendricks's character, Natalie, she mentions that she got pregnant with Rosa, even though like the shot that you have of her, she looks very similar to what you see for the rest of the movie, but she mentions that she was a teenager when she got pregnant, and so she had to put her dreams of being a painter on hold in order to be a mother and a homemaker. And so this wasn't particularly dramatized, if I can remember, but I do get the sense that she resented once Ginger came of age. She saw this woman or this young girl blossoming into a woman, and with a whole life ahead of her, with all these sort of things. And then she had a conversation with her about like, be careful out there, sort of thing, because almost like you don't want to end up like I did, sort of thing. But I think she stopped short of that. And so you can see how there was mother and daughter relationships are always fairly fraught from what I understand, but they're also, especially in this one, it seemed like she was borderline resenting her for the potential that she still had to look forward to, where she had been sort of locked into her role or into the life that she had. And then the unappreciation of the meat pie that like Roland just wouldn't say thank you for cooking. That for me was just like, just say thank you. Just say thank you. But then he would do it and then would throw in and be like, is that what you wanted to hear? And then he used things like emotional blackmail. And it was clearly, he was like, you're totally right. Like a textbook narcissist, and he was using her own words to control her, and like any sort of thought or agency on her part. He was trying to tamp down that if it at all threatened his own sort of well-being. And so when she started to paint again, I was like, oh, that's okay. So she's moved on and making progress. I wasn't entirely sure how she was supporting herself at that point, but not that kind of movie.
I think just to cut on you quickly, I think one of the points that they try to make subtly in that scene, we find out that Christina Hendricks has gone back to painting because Ginger comes back and finds her doing so, and the apartment that they lived in is actually much cleaner. It seems brighter. I think they probably painted the walls white and things like this.
It definitely seemed brighter.
The implication to that to me was that Christina Hendricks was able to support herself doing that because she was no longer supporting her daughter. And so she had that extra cash around just to be able to do some of this stuff. Because at this point, Ginger's living with Roland.
Right. But yeah, and this is, I don't think the point of the movie was this at all, but like I wasn't sure where she was getting that income in the first place. I don't think she had a job. I think she was just...
Oh yeah, I guess, well, I mean, that would have been coming from Roland.
Yeah, because
there was a point where she yelled
Roland was paying some of the bills
Roland.
or whatever, but...
Yeah, she like yelled at Roland, basically was like, I don't have any money. Like, how am I going to support myself? And that was.
But it was but she was getting back into painting, and she seemed to be like moving on with her life, or at least like it was. If not Roland, it may have been Roland and Ginger who were potentially holding her back, and so when Ginger came back and like wanted to stay one night after the what was progressing with Rosa and Roland, she immediately took it back and was like, oh, don't worry about it, never mind, I don't want to do this anymore. When she saw how well her mother was doing, it was almost like she was kind of hoping to be welcomed back with a bit more, not desperation, but like a more need and more urgency. And it's like, oh, like, thank you so much, come back, like, oh, like welcoming arms sort of thing. And Natalie was like, I'm doing pretty good actually, so if you want to hang out with your dad, that's fine.
It's interesting that you bring up that the house was brighter too, because I feel like that was almost like an interesting way of almost the cinematography to reflect her mental state at that point, because it's just like an empty house, but it's bright and like beautiful and just clean. And
I feel like
pristine.
they positioned like a fairly powerful light outside the window just shining in. So even like, and maybe this is not totally accurate, but I remember the window behind Christina Hendricks being virtually white or like blown out itself. And then the rest of the room being kind of like lit up. It was also vastly decluttered. I think the only thing that you see in that room is the easel and the painting supplies and things like that. So it just seemed like visually they were saying that her life, that Christina Hendricks' life at this point in the film, all of the baggage was just gone. And they did, and they just represented it visually. I mean, that's what they did.
Yeah.
And did you notice during the meat pie scene, it was lit by candlelight, and then when they started to have a fight, Christina Hendricks flipped the lights on.
Yeah.
And initially, I thought maybe this was a way of the film telling us like they are either the power's gone out for some reason that we're going to find out later, or maybe they can't afford to pay the power bill, or like some subtle thing about like these are the circumstances of their living situation. But then it was just sort of an affectation, like that it seemed like Roland was doing this for, you know, like the romance of it, or like it's like I like to read by candlelight or whatever it is, because he has that little moment where there's a lot of sort of like little half smiles and looks between both him and Ginger and with Rosa later on, where he's like reading and then he lifts the candle and sort of like smiles at her and she smiles back, and it's just sort of a shorthand for like father-daughter relationship, and they love each other in this sort of business. But well, what did you think about the lights coming back on?
I actually I thought that was pretty cool, and I think it relates back to in some cases the mental state of both of those characters, or at least what Christina Hendricks wanted to get out of that situation versus the reality of what it actually was. So initially we start off, we have the warm light of the candles illuminating the scene. Christina Hendricks has tried to create this almost romantic setting, and then once Roland starts being a dumbass, or Christina Hendricks flicks on the light, is similar to that idea of, you flip on the lights in an apartment and all the cockroaches skittle away, and you're able to see what's underneath, what's underlying far more clearly. And once those lights come on, it's almost like their relationship is laid bare in the cold, hard light. That
can't hide anywhere,
exactly. And that is the exact point when their relationship dissolves for the last time.
I also think it like snaps the audience out of it too. Like you're very entranced in this like sort of romantic mood lighting, and then suddenly the light comes on. You're like, oh, what's happening?
What is this? We've talked about psychology. That was great. There's a lot of stuff coming from that. Now, Tim, you must follow it up with the things that you thought kind of stood out to you? Things that you would like to talk about?
Well, there was, and this is unfortunately, like as I mentioned, like the cinematography was standout, was very impressive. There's a lot of sort of like medium close-up shots, and it was trying to go for like with less dialogue and more just sort of an atmosphere or a mood, like you're getting like the feeling of like they're trying to instill a feeling in the viewer rather than explicitly say this is how you should. This is what this character is doing. This is how they're feeling. You get a lot of the sort of like the effervescence of youth, where they were constantly hitchhiking and just having fun they never encountered like dangers or bad experiences when they were out having fun as they were sort of growing up. But then there were a couple of instances, and then, yeah, like I said, like there were some shots that were absolutely gorgeous. You could have just put it on any kind of poster. But then there were a couple of instances in the editing where, and not the sequential editing, like shot to shot, that sort of jarred me a couple times. There was one shot where it was on Rosa, and then it cut to a little bit later in that same scene, but it wasn't a different portion, and so it was like a jump cut, but it didn't seem to serve a purpose. And then there was another scene where when Ginger was visiting Natalie, you cut from Christina Hendricks to a slightly different angle of Christina Hendricks, but it just felt ever so slightly. And it's one of these things where I assume that everyone is doing their job correctly, and it wasn't a mistake. And so I'm racking my brain as to like why, like, and it's like, other than just being jarring, it was like it felt like it's like, okay, here's where it changes, or here's where like a moment goes from what you think is perfectly reasonable and natural to, oh, something's wrong here. And maybe I was alone. Did you guys notice anything about that?
Well, I'm actually curious. Could you describe like what's actually happening in the scenes? Because the first one, I'm not sure what you're talking about, and the second one is that when Ginger comes home to find Christina Hendricks like doing
when she's got her painting doing, and there's literally a scene, and maybe it might have been just the copy messed up, but they're chatting. It seems to be a fairly like innocuous, like, I was wondering if I could come and stay for a night, maybe not that, like, not for any longer than that. And it's literally goes from like a two shot, and then Ginger sort of walks out of the frame, and then it cuts to a slightly different angle of Christina Hendricks as she turns and sort of follows her. And I instantly started cutting it in my head. It's like, no, you could have just cut to Ginger's back as she was walking away, and then cut to Christina Hendricks' reaction, and then cut back to her, and then this sort of business. And it just felt a little bit, unless it was a mistake. I was trying to get my head around, like, okay, so what is the editor trying to tell us in terms of like story wise? But that was there was another instance, and I can't remember exactly when it happened with Rosa, but in the playground complex, where I think they were chatting about how deep Roland was, and then she was standing, and then she went from that exact position to slightly different, but it was a jump cut, but from the same shot, same take sort of thing.
I honestly don't remember these. Do you, Sandra?
Obviously, you were not watching the film as closely as you should be, TJ.
That's absolutely true.
I do remember them. I just don't know. They could have been a mistake, honestly.
Those sort of things bump me for some reason. Yeah. And it always feels just like, oh, you did what? Okay, no, what did you mean by that? If that wasn't a mistake, but
I'm gonna go back and watch those two scenes and then put my thoughts in the top comment on this video so everyone can know.
Tim was wrong. There was nothing wrong with it. It was beautiful.
There was actually no jump cuts. You actually just fell asleep.
Yeah, you're just bad at watching movies. So what did you think about the? She early on, Ginger mentions that she wants to be a poet. Mm-hmm. And then so she's often, writing her thoughts on page, which is a great way of getting inside the internal dialogue. But with the backdrop of the activism, like, they could have picked any sort of time to do this film. It does feel fairly autobiographical, and when I looked at the director, it seemed like it lined up a little bit with her age. She was born in the early 40s, and so she would have been about the same age at about the same time. But the threat of nuclear annihilation is, and I've tried to think about this in our own time, because like it seems to be taken for granted that we're not going to get wiped out anymore. But I remember my parents talking about 1963 specifically, and they didn't know. Mm-hmm. And it was an incredibly, and then there was a period where they didn't know if it was going to happen, and then there was a period where they thought it was going to. It's an incredibly powerful performance at the end, and it's so real when Elle Fanning, you can, like, she's not distraught in a Hollywood kind of way. Yeah. She's distraught in an incredibly real way, where she's like, heaving and
Yeah.
like it's like she can't get the words out. It's like a sobbing sort of like just like racked with emotion. It's an incredibly powerful performance. But it's the denouement where you learn the whole, like what Roland's been up to. She starts the sequence initially by expressing this existential dread about being everyone dying from this nuclear holocaust. And yeah, what do you guys think about the overall sort of the atmosphere of this potentially like world destroying phenomena that was hanging over the character development?
For me, it really fed into the panic that Elle Fanning's character Ginger felt. I think it like kind of amplified that almost times 10. It was sort of, it felt like because her world, she knew that the world outside was falling apart, but she really was trying to hold on to the pieces of her family life and trying to keep that together so that if they did die, she could possibly die on a happy memory. Yeah. But I think because it was falling apart, she had that moment of like, oh shit, like I'm going to have a panic attack essentially. And that to me, that was the pinnacle of that performance. And I thought it came through like amazingly. And that was probably my favorite scene of the whole movie, just because it really did give us that like notion of pure panic that she has, that both these sides of her are falling apart and she can't do anything about it.
So I'm trying to reconcile what you guys are saying about this with how I feel about it myself, because they don't really match up. For me, when we're talking about the like trying to set up this entire idea of existential dread that's brought on by having these nuclear warheads so close by and the threat of just being blown up at any moment, it seemed like Ginger was the only person who actually cared about this, even amongst the activists that she was with. The film kind of goes out of its way to make sure that you know that Ginger feels this way, and no one else really gets that except for maybe Annette Bening here and there. And so it felt like the film kept telling me that there was existential dread, but didn't really do anything else to show me that. And I'm not really sure how to reconcile that with what you were just saying, Sandra, because I do really like that interpretation of it. And so I wonder if it was the intention of the filmmakers to strip away everyone else's feelings about it so that it accentuated Ginger so much more.
Yeah.
But yeah, for overall, it felt like Ginger was the only person who was actually concerned about this, even though it's supposed to be this sort of society spanning dread.
And I think that was part of it as well, because you definitely had Natalie and Roland, who didn't seem to speak on it particularly. Like Roland seemed to encourage her activist leanings, but didn't get involved himself at all. I want to say at some point a character said, like, there's nothing we can do about it. Like, it's too big, sort of thing. Whereas
I think that was probably Rosa, wasn't it?
Was it Rosa? Yeah.
Yeah. Like I think there was a couple of moments, at least one, where Ginger and Rosa are talking about the anti-war movement or the anti-nuclear war movement, and Ginger's just like, well, it's in the hands of God. And Rosa says it's in the hands of God, and Ginger's like, well, she says something snarky afterwards, which I kind of liked, which I can now not remember. But yeah, I think that was part of their relationship, and its divergence was that they couldn't see eye to eye on what Ginger was wanting to do, because Rosa's just like, hey, we can't do anything about it. It's in God's hands now.
Yeah. Well, and Rosa definitely, we haven't talked about Rosa very much. She seemed to be much more of a hedonistic, live in the moment sort of lifestyle, where
Typical Catholic,
right? But well, and the funny thing is, it's like there is that sense of if you have a firm belief in your religious upbringing, then you don't need to necessarily worry about a lot of the larger things in life. Like, you don't need to protest against war because it is God's will in this sort of business. And even though she's having premarital sex and definitely without a prophylactic, well, she's doing it without a prophylactic, which is what the Catholics want, but she isn't concerned with this existential threat that Ginger is. And Ginger does seem to find a kindred spirit with Annette Bening. And they talk about Bertrand Russell and like direct action and this sort of business, and how activism and protest isn't enough. So it feels like Ginger is progressing towards like, we need to do something more. It seems to imply that like violence is on the horizon, if not something of like more than just sort of a sit-in. But it does speak to that notion of like, here's this weapon, here's this that is controlled by people that you don't necessarily trust to have your best interests at heart, and you have no control over when this weapon is used, and this is a life-ending weapon. This destroys everybody. I think it comes down to control. Like she feels like her family is spiraling out of control, and that was the one thing that was sort of relatively stable amongst this world that potentially could wipe them all out. And once that falls apart, especially when Roland sleeps with Rosa, then she has nothing to fall back on. Oh, what did you make of the doctor in the jail cell? Because that was a weird little
That
moment.
was an interesting. Yeah, I was wondering about that too, actually.
My initial reading of it, and maybe I'm being a little too distrusting of authority figures, especially when they
Distrust away, my friend. Distrust away.
especially when they happen to be in prisons when people were picked up for protesting against the government. But my initial reaction to that is, this guy's trying to get her to admit to being depressed or mentally unstable so that they can lock her up in a mental institution of some kind so she can stop protesting and they can just get this person off the streets.
Do you think they were doing like an individual basis, like they were going to everybody they arrested and was like, clearly depressed, clearly, because I agree with you. Like he was trying to lead her towards like, you seem depressed. Are you depressed? Maybe you should have some Xanax or whatever.
Yeah. Tell me you're depressed and we can work on things from there.
Yeah, and then they didn't want to release her to Benning and Spall and Platt because it's like, oh no, she might have a mental illness. And Platt had the great lines. It's like. It's like something like fearing getting wiped out by nuclear weapons. Like, wouldn't you be a little concerned about that too?
Yeah. But yeah, I do consider myself a bit of a cynic in those regards. Sandra, did you have the same kind of feeling?
Yes and no. For me, I was kind of like, that's an odd scene to include in this movie. I wonder if they were trying to hint at anything. And that's just my brain being like trying to overanalyze everything.
It was just like, is that standard operating procedure when you round up, 100 plus protesters, a doctor, like a physician, I guess, or maybe he was a psychologist, goes and visits each one, and
it would have been more instructive.
Does a quick diagnosis.
It would have been more instructive if the film gave us another scene, or like in, say, the conversation that the police are having with the godparents and Annette Bedding, that we would see the therapist or the psychologist doing the same thing with someone else, or like having someone being like sent away in a straitjacket with the psychologist in tow, just being like, oh, it's so sad that you're depressed about this thing.
We got one, guys.
Even though I'm sure like in the context of this film, that's probably too heavy-handed of a technique to use, but to sort of put the pin in this so we can actually just say definitively, I think it would require something like that. So the film is probably just trying to let you bring your own biases to and have them reflected by this person, so it can tell you a bit about yourself.
Yeah,
and how you view psychologists.
100%.
Don't trust them.
Exactly.
They're always trying to put you in jail.
Don't trust the shrinks. Yeah. But what about Rosa? Because like we haven't. The film is called Ginger and Rosa, and I know you don't necessarily need characters to enjoy a film, but
It's true.
It's not called like The Light of Day or like The Shadow of the Mushroom Cloud or Poetry and Prose. It's not.
These are all good titles.
For me, titles and endings are incredibly important because titles are the way that you enter or approach a work, and then the ending. I'm a big believer that the ending is the conceit, and so. If the film is called Ginger and Rosa, I go in expecting a story about two girls and their relationship, and I feel like I got a lot of Ginger, but not a lot of Rosa.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm wrong.
So the one thing I kind of wanted to raise about Rosa, and this also comes from how Roland is shown in his conversations with Christina Hendricks / Natalie, he's shown as being a very manipulative person, especially that conversation we were talking about with the meat pie. I didn't see much of this in the film, or at least that I can remember it. But did you guys think that Roland manipulated Rosa into that relationship, or was he reacting to the sort of googly eyes that she was giving him early on in the film, especially in that scene where Ginger and Rosa are getting their jeans shrunk?
I think that Rosa definitely, I don't think it was he like purposefully manipulated her or anything. I think it was definitely like she had these ideals already kind of instilled in her, and she saw something that she wanted, and she wanted to have that. Whereas like Roland is very much like live and let live kind of idea. And like, he's just very much like, if this is going to happen, I'm just going to let it happen.
Yeah.
And that's sort of what happened between the two of them. And he was not going to say no.
Yeah. No, he seemed to be putting out this energy where, just as you say, like he's a live and let live kind of guy, where like the rules of society are meant to be pushed against rather than blindly accepted, including like taboos like sleeping with your daughter's friend.
Yeah.
And we're all human beings, we're all free individuals and this sort of thing. And if this particular person, regardless of her status or where she is in my social group, wants to gravitate towards me, who am I to say no to this? And then if we have a connection, like Rosa talked about how much they had in common and how deep his feelings were and all this sort of business. And so he definitely seemed like he was willing to, if not directly invite that relationship, he certainly wasn't putting any kind of brakes on it.
No, definitely not. And I think to a certain extent, we find out that he is encouraging it. We know that they're kind of pen pals for a brief moment in the film.
Yeah.
2 letters. 2 letters, and then they bang.
Yeah. That's all you really need. And then you invite them out to the boat and allow Rosa to haphazardly invite along Ginger. Because,
And there was that weird little moment where Rosa said, I'm going out on his boat next weekend, and Roland said, you should come. He said, in fact, it's probably better if you do. And I read that as that was the last sort of shred of his decency or whatever you want to call it, saying, okay, I probably won't have sex with her if my daughter's there.
Yeah.
And
then
he
look what
does.
happens.
And it's like the fucking point. Or like, and like, what have you done to your, like, and it was just, for me, it was like the rudeness of your friend to hump your friend's dad.
Yeah.
And then the inhumanity of the father to completely ignore, like he shushed her at one point. Like you could hear them engaging in sexual activity, and then he shushes her when she's starting to make more noise. So he's still like you get the sense that there's a level of shame where he knows he shouldn't be doing this, but he's still fucking doing it.
Yep.
Oh yeah.
And he sucks. I hate him so much.
It's actually interesting that you brought up before that they talk about how they have a lot in common, but like the movie makes a point to bring up like she's very religious and he's always talking about how religion is bullshit.
Yes.
That's true, yeah.
And basically, and like he's also like not apathetic about the nuclear war movement, but she is because she doesn't care.
Yeah.
So it's just interesting to me that their core values are not aligned in any way. It's just more so we just want to bang.
It's superficial.
Yeah.
It's like you see the similarities that you want to see and you ignore everything else.
And I think with Rosa, there's a moment where she talks about why they actually do get along, or like Ginger tells Rosa like, oh, you know, my dad is just gonna like leave you for the next young pretty thing that comes along.
Yeah.
And Rosa's like, well, no, because we connect on this very basic level that I believe had to do with the fact that both of their fathers left them at a very early age.
His mother left him.
Okay, so it was a
and then
parental
her
figure.
father left her. Yeah.
Yeah. You can't really build a relationship around that.
It's shared trauma, I
Yeah.
guess. But it's kind of a fucked up thing to bond over, I guess.
Yeah, it
Or
is.
like it's not the worst thing in the world to find solace with another person with, but it's probably not enough to build a strong relationship.
Especially when it's your daughter's best friend.
Especially, yes.
Which, interestingly, I feel like that was almost a bit of a callback to his actual behaviors in relationships as it is. Because I feel like Christina Hendricks also kind of went into that relationship, sort of looking at him as like a wounded animal and wanting to help him.
Yeah.
And Rosa is now doing the same thing. I just feel like it's a pattern. It's a nasty pattern. No.
Okay, so we're getting up into the length of this, but there was one thing that I did want to kind of bring up, and we've touched on it a little bit already, but just to maybe codify it a little bit, is how the film uses space as a way of kind of reflecting what's going on in the interior of a character, or even just to like better illustrate to you what is happening in a scene. So we talked about already the scene with Christina Hendricks and Ginger, when Ginger returns and sees that her mom is doing really well and is painting it again, and everything's kind of like bright and cheery and it's decluttered and all this stuff. there was another instance that I wanted to point to where Ginger initially goes to ask her father if she can live with him. And the way that we're introduced to this, there's a fairly wide shot of the room, and there's a table in the middle. There's a chair there, which I assume is a dining table. It's also where Roland does his work. And then the room that you're basically shown is a large room that is kind of a kitchen. And the room itself is fairly sparse, but it's also dimly lit. It looks somewhat decrepit, somewhat run down. And what I took from this immediately from that shot is that we know that Ginger's going here to ask this of her father, and we can see that there's room there for Ginger, but we also get the sense that this is absolutely not a place where Ginger should be. And I think Roland strangely like recognizes this in a weird moment of like self-awareness where he's like, oh, like, you probably shouldn't be here. I don't know if he says it explicitly.
I'm fairly certain he explicitly says like it's the worst possible place for you, but he does it with like a half grin, and then they exchange one of those smiles where just like we're getting away with something here by you living with me in this place that it has no place for a teenage girl. Aren't we naughty? Aren't we breaking society's taboos, sort of thing? And it fits it perfectly with his character of. Like he doesn't have anything set up for her. It's not, he's not a good father.
No,
but
not at all.
But by bringing her into a situation that she is not well suited, he is living his truth, if you will, of like, yeah, we're just doing whatever we want, sort of thing.
It's also interesting that you mentioned the part where she's asking, is there any room for me? It's almost as if like she's asking like, is there any room for me in your life?
Yeah.
And then like her and Rosa have that issue, then it's sort of like she's being pushed. It just like, it all kind of like clicked in my head, and I was like, whoa, it's so deep.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of maybe, I'm sure, like, I hate talking about like the intentions of a film because because largely like they don't matter at all, or at least they shouldn't when we're discussing the film and how it's constructed. But when we talk about things like this, I wonder if the way that space is used in these two scenes that we're talking about, I'm sure there's other examples of it that we could cite. I can't think of any right now because I'm tired. But to the degree that Sally Potter, I believe is the name of the director, the degree to which she wanted to set this up as being like, oh yeah, once you relate the space and how the people work into it, the actual character intentions become so much more clear. Like, is that something that she intended, or is it something that just kind of happens because all of these things tend to coalesce with each other? I don't know. But I think it's great when those epiphany moments can happen, when those things kind of like can click for someone when they're watching a film. And that's why we talk about them.
That's why
like
we love
this.
talking about them. That's right. I wanted to read a very quick quote before we end. Because like A24, especially the earlier days, it's kind of hard to get a lot of information about their thought process and this sort of thing. They are apparently fairly notorious for not giving a ton of interviews, but they do. I managed to find this one statement about Ginger and Rosa, where they say, it was like a press statement from like Deadline or something. We fell in love with Ginger and Rosa. We've been fans of Sally Potter for a long time. She has crafted a touching, heartfelt, and extraordinary work anchored by an absolutely incredible performance by Elle Fanning, which already has a tremendous amount of love from audiences and journalists alike. We look forward to bringing the film to a wide audience and showing the world one of the best performances of the year. So a lot of that is basic shilling. Yeah. But it is speaking to the notion that A24 tends to home in on performances, on things that they genuinely feel passionate about, rather than like this will perform well in this market, or this is going to make us money over here. And I don't know how they were able to survive using that kind of like beautiful kind of yardstick. But it really does speak to their commitment to just like not just going for the easy dollar or the thing that's obvious. It's like, no, this performance in particular, like they talk about the director, and they talk about Elle Fanning. They don't talk about too much more than that, but it's just like, these are two standout things that are worth bringing to the rest of the world, making sure the rest of the world sees. And then I think maybe that's it. It's a nebulous and kind of amorphous brand to have, but it just feels less like, I want to believe that if I were running a studio with millions of dollars, I would be able to be like, I want that one. I like that one, and I don't care if anyone else likes that one.
Yeah.
I want that one to be on a big screen so people can see it, because maybe other people will like it, and if they don't, fuck them.
Yeah, I think maybe something else that we can consider for the early days of A24 is that they are at least somewhat concerned, and you talked about this a bit with the performances, but also with directors, and specifically getting directors who are somewhat proven and have some accolades behind them. Roman Coppola, to that degree, when we're talking about A Glimpse Inside the Mind of Charles I III.
We agreed we were never going to talk about that again.
Well, I'm gonna, and by that I mean I'm just gonna briefly mention it. To the degree that
Go watch our first podcast; it's great, or listen to it rather.
To the degree we put that kind of accolade on Roman Coppola, probably not as much. But when you look at this film being Sally Potter, just looking here at her Wikipedia page, she did win Best Film for one of her first films, Orlando, back in 1992.
Right.
And then for the next film that we're going to be talking about, Spring Breakers, Harmony Korine has, yeah, he has his. I'm sure like a lot of his films have played in festivals because he's very much a. I want to say he's a festival director. Like a lot of his films kind of.
I like to think of him as an enfant terrible.
Yeah, you could probably say that as well.
But only when I speak French.
Yeah, but also I kind of like your idea that A24 as buyers of film kind of go in on performances, because I think that's actually a great way to set up Spring Breakers, because that whole film was sold on James Franco's performance as this weird alien dude.
Yeah.
Like obviously they were hoping that audiences would show up for Vanessa Hudgens and Selena Gomez and some of the other
As you've never seen them before.
Exactly. Like they were definitely going after that. But I think for the people who didn't care about Selena Gomez and Vanessa Hudgens and the rest, they're like, oh, James Franco looks like a goddamn maniac in this, and I need to see it.
Yeah.
And as we will find out next time on the A24 Cult podcast, that's probably going to be quite true. I feel like we may only talk about James Franco. Who knows? Who knows? But with that said, we've been going on now a little over an hour, so I think it's probably time to close it out. Any final thoughts on Ginger and Rosa, or Africa and the Catholic, as maybe we could call it?
No.
Once
we're
again, sweaters are incredibly on point in this movie.
Okay.
It makes me want to, like, we're just ending
They
summer.
always wore the same goddamn
They
sweater.
always wore the
Yeah.
same sweater. They were not twins, but they might as well have been. But everyone else as well. Like, I do have to say, like, Roland, as much of a bastard as he was, dude could rock like a boat outfit. Like, he had the sweater and the jacket. He looked great, no matter what scene he was in.
He lived the boat
You can
life.
understand why the women fell for him. Yeah.
Was there a moment where they had worn like normal, like regular clothes and then put the sweaters on top as sort of like a way to like hide their clothing from their parents or something? I thought I saw something like that.
I'm not sure. The only thing I can
I
really
wouldn't be
remember about
surprised.
their clothing,
that feels like a standard move for,
Yeah,
for sneak out.
because I remember Rosa looking in the mirror and like kind of like tying off a shirt, and then they're like suddenly putting on sweaters. And
Yeah,
I'm
because
like,
Rosa stole Ginger's mother's shirt at one point. I
Yeah.
remember that's like, isn't that mom's? So
Yeah.
it's just like typical teenager.
damn kids.
Yeah, kids.
Yeah, I was thinking maybe it has something to do with the fact like they're always shown wearing the same things up until the point where their relationship splits, and then
Yeah.
that's when maybe the clothing
Yeah.
changes. But I can't remember that specifically.
But that sounds
actually
right.
what
I believe you.
happens.
That's exactly what happened.
Cool. We're trustworthy people, and that's why you listen to us, dear listeners. Thank you. So with all that,
If we're wrong, mention it in the comments.
yes, please mention everything in the comments. Tell us all of your feelings about this movie specifically, whether or not this little discussion has made you want to go watch it, and if you have seen it, just maybe something that we've missed, something that we overlooked. We would love to hear from you. All that said, we are at the end of this episode of the A24 Cult. We would love it if you were to just subscribe to this channel, like this video, even though it's more of just an audio video podcast thing. And please come back next time when we talk about Spring Breakers. Also, this is something that we forgot to do at the end of our last podcast, which was for Nostalgia Goggles on Double Dragon. Sandra, you are picking the next film that we are watching for Nostalgia Goggles. Could you please tell us what it is?
we are watching The Little Rascals.
Oh my God.
I can't remember how the theme song actually goes.
So I'm very looking forward to
Oh, Tay.
that. You can come back exactly 1 week from the time that you listen to this, if you listen to this on Monday when it came out, which means you're a good person, and you will hear a discussion about Little Rascals. So definitely looking forward to that. And then 2 weeks later, it will be Spring Breakers. So thank you so much for watching. Watching. We keep making this mistake because we think we're on TV.
Yeah.
There's no cameras here. It shouldn't be confusing.
But they're probably looking at their screens right now.
Yeah.
Or at least they're definitely looking at it now, going,
Looking at
"Why
that.
aren't you ending this?"
They're looking at that sweet graphic I made, being like, "Oh, this guy's got Photoshop skills out the wazoo." Yes, thank you again for listening to us, and we will catch you in the next one.